welcome to the Tech Insider podcast. You've got Ben Baldieri here from the GPU and Panchea,
close.
Panchea. Oh, I mispronounced the enunciation there. But from Panchea, who many of you might remember from, see on LinkedIn, is very vocal, visible, and kind of journalistic, it puts a lot of pen to paper on things around digital infrastructure, GPU-related infrastructure, news, updates, whether it's power and cooling and compute. You've really kind of come out of the, not out of the woodwork per se, Ben, but certainly, a thought leader in this space now with a lot of the depth and experience you kind of bring to the table. And yeah, man, great to have you on the show and great to talk to you. And yeah, maybe just flip it over to you and introduce yourself, which you've done a million times, but let's just do it again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And really appreciate that, Nick. Yeah, it's been an interesting, 6 months or so, really started posting regularly about what's going on in this little niche in the market where the power requirements and the compute is going in one direction. The liquidity required to deploy it is also going in the same direction as well. And what an exciting little spot to be in at the moment. So I joined Panchea last year, April sort of time. And for those that don't know, we're a hardware reseller. We focus on the GPU as a service platforms, neoclouds. That is our ideal customer profile. First thing that I did in joining Panchea, in trying to understand our customers, what their problems were, was build out some financial models around GPU as a service, around inference as a service, and in doing that, developed a really good understanding of really how this space is operating. What do the cash flows look like? Who's consuming the compute? What's needed to deploy these clusters from a data center standpoint, from a hardware standpoint, and also from a financing standpoint, because it's the term that Nvidia likes to use. It's high value, I think. It's expensive or high value, depending on how you're looking to describe it, right? Came across a lot of marketing and PR spin, I think, is probably the kindest way to put it. And it's exhausting wading through all that, right? There's a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of announcements that are happening. And the GPU kind of started as my way of trying to cut through all of that, because I figured if I'm having this problem, I'm sure I'm not the only one having this problem. The best way to learn about what's going on is to put information out into the market, and you tend to get more information back, which means that you end up with a better understanding, which means that you can put more out and then hopefully cut through some of the noise. Figure out what's actually going on. And here we are.
Well,
6 months later, which feels a lot longer because this space operates like dog years, right? 1 year is 7.
Everything's going so fast. Well, this is a good time to do it because we're on the eve-ish of GTC, or the week eve, if you want to call it that, of GTC, which starts next week, where you'll be attending there, Ben, which is great. We'll catch up in person for the first time, and absolutely, I'm sure with a bunch of other people in your network for the first time too, especially on the US side, you being based in the UK. So yeah, it'd be great to meet you and have a chat about this stuff and share our love of Jensen's attire.
Right, exactly. We've
both got the matching.
The uniform is ready. It's going to see what sartorial choices Jensen is making.
Exactly.
This time round, is it going to be another $6,000 Tom Ford crocodile leather skin jacket? I don't know. Maybe not.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun week. So, I thought it would be good to get together, especially with someone like you who's, really, got a good breadth of knowledge and you're really aware of what's going on in the industry. But equally, you're going into depth in these things. Like I'm really impressed, and as are many others, obviously, with the interactions you're getting, with your publications, because like what you said, there's a lot of noise, right? There's a ton of noise, and you're just trying to find the signal. And what I personally really appreciate about when I read your stuff is you cut to that, signal and cut through the noise. But equally, you do it in a way that I find myself kind of struggling, especially on the financial side. And I'll come back to that in a sec, but like specifically the ROI on some of these things. And, there's a lot of questions. I talk to analysts a couple of times a week, sometimes, multiple times a day. And the question they ask me is like, how real is this demand? Like, who's using it? And I think we can answer that now. But then you turn around and go, well, then how does that work through the sort of work streams into a return on investment for, tens, hundreds, and billions of dollars being invested into digital infrastructure, whether it's in a data center, it's on the compute, it's in engineering teams, it's, professional services, it's everything. And so, you could argue different verticals are getting different returns on that investment. You could argue that, there's contracts and there's, HR tasks and there's engineering tasks. Like a lot of the chatbots are really good at doing some fantastic coding, and good enough coding as well. And so you're kind of getting some good return on investment there instead of paying potentially very expensive software engineering, salaries and rates. But, I still see a lot, and this is maybe a question to you, what you're seeing at Panchera, is that are you seeing the enterprises adopting it really, I won't say at scale, but are they doing anything more than sort of proof of concept? And are they kind of dabbling, like where is the needle in what you're experiencing in your business?
So there's a couple of questions there. I think the first one to the enterprises dabbling beyond the POCs or maybe messing around with Copilot or Salesforce, Agentforce or something along those lines. No, not just yet.
Yeah.
Now, does that seem to be shifting? Yes. So from some of the partners in the GPU as a service space that we've been working with, they're starting to see an increase in the number of enterprise email address domains that are signing up for access to their platforms. It's no longer personal emails, which it has been up until this point. There does seem to be a shift happening in terms of who is signing up to access. But a big part of the issue right now from an enterprise adoption standpoint is that not all GPU as a service platforms are created equal in terms of the certifications that these platforms have, the data centers that they're being deployed into, how the clusters are being configured, and ultimately also what you can do with the compute as well. So on the one end of the scale, you've got the likes of CoreWeave, the Nebulouses, where they've got like the AI studio, or they've just acquired Weights and Biases or something along those lines, which means that they have this developing platform which allows you to do more than just consume the compute, which is what enterprises seem to be looking for. They're looking for ways to engage with ultimately what they're buying in a way beyond just paying less for it than they would do on AWS, right? They want to be able to do something with it. They want the services. They want the full stack offering that allows them to ultimately generate some business value and see some return on investment on whatever it is that they're looking to do. The other end of the scale, some of the other neoclouds, some of the other GPU providers, they don't have that kind of offering.
Metal and it's basic
exactly
resold tin.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's commodity. At the moment, there's so much capacity available in the market, and you're
seeing those rates. I mean, those rates that they're affording dropping pretty significantly. And I think you talked about it being the death of the obituary of the GPU, right? And so I wonder, like, I'm really interested in seeing how that plays out for the people in the market that are kind of in that sub, let's call it a couple of thousand GPUs up, from a dozen or a couple of dozen to a couple of thousand. It seems like they're in a really precarious position. They've gotten some capital in probably the worst time to get capital, in 22 and 23 and 24, kind of high rates. They're sitting on GPUs that have just appreciated pretty quickly. And, and the availability to sell this stuff is sort of, the demand is there, but the margins are certainly eroding.
Wafer thin.
Yeah, exactly. Silicon wafer thin.
Right.
And that's certainly going to be an interesting space to watch this year as some of those interest payments need to be made and, all of that stuff happens. I mean, I think in the S1 filing of CoreWeave, a ton of their debt is associated with those interest payments because they went and borrowed large amounts of money to go and acquire the compute. And so they're at the top end of that. They're in a good situation, like you mentioned, because they've got some great software and build out a team, and they're kind of sailed away from potentially some of the neocloud problems that we just discussed. They have different challenges that they'll be sailing into and around, but certainly the boats are, seeing a storm on the horizon from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think consolidation really is what's going to end up having to happen. And this is a message that I keep preaching. It doesn't seem to be any real differentiation in the mid-market. You've got some players that are making the leap from mid-market, smaller scale operations to that next level. They're developing their internal sales teams. The platforms are developing. Maybe they have some other sort of moat in that maybe they own a data center or something along those lines. And with that, they're able to access different kinds of costs of capital. They've got some other differentiator. They've got different kinds of partnerships in place as a result. But that's not everyone. And I've got a list of 150 or so different providers. I would wager there's probably about 100 or so that are doing basically the same thing. That's a tough market to be in, especially when the other 50 or so are different and you're all going off the same customers at the moment.
Totally.
And if you don't have a differentiator or some sort of advantage, it's a race to the bottom.
Sure. Are you seeing anything? Yeah. Are you seeing anything different from a resale point of view, and maybe both in your, do you call it a day, both things a day job at the moment? Because it feels like there's a lot of energy that would need to go into, I know how long these things take, right? Like it's just, you seem to do it, very quickly and very well. Like kudos for you for that. I know how long it takes me, and maybe that's just my personality and my like smooth brain problem. But like you do a great job at that, but I know how long it takes. Do you find it difficult to balance the two? And on both sides, I would imagine there's competing priorities. But I guess the root of the question was going to be, in both of those worlds, though obviously they interconnect, are you seeing a swing from sort of training into inference? Are you seeing kind of, if so, what does that look like? Or is it still kind of really heavy training, large clusters, or modest to large size clusters that are going to be doing model training?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both, really. So some of the longer term contract opportunities that are out there at the moment and seem to be out there at the time of recording, and given how fast this market moves, they may well have already disappeared and the information just hasn't made its way to me just yet. Those longer term contracts on, say, a H100 cluster, which is now end of life, right? Which is an absurd thing to be saying, right? But it's not far off. That is moved down the stack, right? So what we're seeing happen is that a new hardware generation is announced. The shareholders are potentially very happy, and everyone wants access to the shiny new thing. And then whatever the previous cutting edge was moves down the stack. So it's no longer training. It's like, right, maybe it's training and a bit of inference. And then as new generations come out, it becomes inference over time, right? So the H100 now was the training chip that everyone wanted. Now it's an inference machine. Now it's an inference play. And we're seeing and we're hearing about long-term contract opportunities for H100s for inference specifically. In terms of large-scale inference happening, a lot, not really just yet. A few bits and pieces here and there, but again, that kind of feeds into the enterprise side. Not really just yet. It's getting there, and with various agent announcements, right? So we've had like Manus, for example, has been the thing that everyone's been talking about this week, which is a multi-agent Claude wrapper, as far as anyone can tell. Yeah. People have asked it to build an open source version of itself, and as far as I know, there's like 4 or 5 different open source versions of it out there already now as well. It's happening. Like the development of the application layer is happening, which ultimately is going to be the thing that drives inference, but not yet. And then that kind of feeds into the whole enterprise side as well. That the big piece that doesn't seem to have really been solved yet, or is really being given kind of the credence that it really needs to from an enterprise customer's perspective, is the data layer. Like, where is that data? How is that data, right? If you've got terrible data from a terrible structuring and it's all over the place, you're not necessarily going to have a particularly good time when it comes to fine-tuning or developing your own models or anything along those lines. And I think that there's a real opportunity there for making that process easier for an enterprise customer, whereby you're potentially deploying a hybrid cloud setup, you're deploying into an on-prem environment for them, making the process easy whereby they can come in, they can fine-tune a model on their own data, and you can make it super user-friendly and super secure, and you can help with the processing of the unstructured data or the cleaning of the data or whatever it is that needs to happen. That's going to be great. But as it currently stands, that isn't something that's happening at scale just yet. Yeah, when that happens, then I think we'll see more of that inference wave. happen. It's like some of the platforms are now starting to look at doing that and offering that as a service. But then ultimately that becomes a commodity service as well, right? So as soon as one person does it and it starts working, then we'll probably see everyone else start to do it as well. And then it becomes a case of, right, how well developed is your go-to-market strategy and what advantages do you have from a conventional standpoint as opposed to we've got the hardware, come and use it.
I've seen, it's a good point, because I've seen, kind of, I wouldn't say arguments, but sort of information on both sides of that. So I think what you're kind of referring to is what a kind of a 2.0 version of data lakes and data warehouses and stuff, because they were like, well, this is going to be great. We're going to throw all your data in here. We can do all these analytics and, it's going to be great. But your data has to be great, because if it's not and it's crappy, then, you get, garbage in, garbage out, right? And so, and a lot of work and consulting and efforts kind of worked on both ends of that spectrum. And some of that was completely, I would say a lot of it was, necessary, right? I've seen alternate viewpoints on with AI, its ability to actually fix some of that, because it's got some form of intelligence, kind of on the filtering in, and the ability to go, well, even if it is crap, even if your data sucks, we will try and cleanse it, clean it. But obviously, you've got to have a lot of knowledge about what that data is, what you need to be removed out of it. Like, you need to know where the bodies are buried for it to be, useful, which, again, you're putting a lot of onus back there on the owners of that data, which they may not actually know what they, a lot of businesses don't actually know what they've got. So I think there's definitely...
And also, from a compliance and an audit standpoint, right? Like, you don't necessarily want to throw absolutely everything you've got into a model, because not everyone in a large-scale enterprise should or is meant to have access to all things at all times. And you don't want to be in a situation whereby you've fine-tuned a model on a given data set. And then all of a sudden, everyone has access to absolutely everything. That's a compliance nightmare, right? Also, if you're running inference workloads on your data, or you're running RAG or something along those lines, right, then you're also going to want to know what's been inferred, who's done it, what's the output. Like, you need all of these audit trails and everything as well. And that needs a lot of work. From the conversations that we're having, that area needs a lot of work, right? And you're not going to want to deploy a fine-tuned model direct into production, right? You wouldn't do that in any other software context.
Totally.
There's a lot that needs to be done there.
There's a lot more at risk of this, in that from that point of view too, right? So I think the like you sort of mentioned, a lot of those neoclouds don't necessarily have those certifications, that would typically a business would expect to do as they walk through a door, look on the sticker, like look on the window and go, where's the okay, yeah, no. And then they'd walk off. Or actually, there's nothing on the window. I won't even bother, driving past. So, there's definitely a reckoning there, I think, especially for compliance and, accreditory, requirements by specific industries, by specific countries. The sovereign AI becomes a big thing. So without going into too much detail, I work for a large inference player. And so they've done some great deals, globally. And one of which was, a sovereign AI for a particular country. And so, I guess from that point of view, I think we'll see a lot more of those sovereign AI plays, nation state players, as it relates to those countries. And I think the advantage and maybe the advantage for Europe is that, there's so many countries and you can do so many of these things. The challenge is that, it's going to be in each individual country making individual, assessment and, evaluation and determination of what to do. And that will potentially slow things down a little bit, because what works for one country doesn't work for the one 5 minutes across the border. So it's kind of what's good for the goose is not good for the gander in that respect. But it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out, because, we move so quickly that we sitting waiting for regulation or waiting for compliance and things hasn't happened yet. It will happen at some point, but, the horse is bolted to some degree, trying to put a lid on the things that people want to use and do.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. But then I think that's more on the consumer side, right? So if you're a large scale enterprise and you're operating in some sort of regulated industry, so let's say it's like financial services or insurance or pharma or something along those lines, right? Your from an AI regulatory standpoint, there'll be one set of frameworks like the EU AI Act, for example, right? There's one set of frameworks that you're going to have to comply with there. But then with all of the other various bits and pieces that you're going to have to comply with that are industry specific, but then you've also got things like GDPR and Schrems 2 and like what's going on with everything in that space as well. Throw all of these things into the mix, coupled with the technology that hasn't necessarily been tested in that kind of production environment, whereby there aren't any best practices for how to navigate all of these things. And there's questions around the reliability, right? There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and it's not entirely clear how things can go right, I think, at this stage. Now,
Yeah,
there
definitely.
is the impetus to get things right is there, right? Because now we find ourselves in interesting times from a global geopolitical standpoint, which means that there is a very large incentive to get things right very, very quickly, making sure that the data is in the right place, making sure that that data is not exposed to geopolitical risk. If it's in a platform, for example, whereby there are now questions around whether or not it's supposed to be there and is it entirely secure, right? It's an interesting place to be. So I think the incentive is to figure these things out. And I think the tech is interesting in that it is a performance enhancer to a degree when things are operating as you expect them to. Things can get done faster, but how fast and when, if I knew that question, if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be a very wealthy person.
You would be talking to me on my podcast.
No, I still would. I'd just be wearing
I know you would.
I'd be wearing a nicer leather jacket. That's all that'd be different.
Well, so going from, the I guess the heaviness of compliance and that sort of thing to GTC, right? So we're taping this or videoing, or like, is it called taping anymore? I think it's like recording.
Yeah, we can call it taping.
Call it taping, rewind, fast forward, and all that kind of noise. And so we're doing that before GTC. It's Friday the 14th. GTC starts on Monday. You're headed over from the UK on Sunday, right? You're leaving over on Sunday. So Tuesday is the keynote. We've got some announcements expected. What I can run through a list of sort of things that I collated that, what the industry, kind of at a whole expects, and we can kind of go through them. Yep. Why don't we just do that real quick? What's really interesting is that these things are happening like every year, like at there's a consumer, conference that, the consumer stuff is announced. GTC is typically on the data center side. We talk about, GPUs, network, system architecture, et cetera. What's crazy is like, the roadmap has kind of been discussed previously. So most of this stuff is kind of known, right? And we know what we're expecting, and there might be some human, like more robotic stuff happening and some cool stuff there. But anyway, I'll get into it. And my concern is keeping up this cadence, right? Because lithographies of GPU, process, being able to press these things out at shrinking nodes is going to get more challenging. You got to get more memory into these things because it needs more memory. The heat dissipation of this stuff is getting more and more difficult, and the engineering for the cooling alone is almost as challenging than, doing it on your own silicon, with the level steps up. So yeah, I'll get into it. It gives me hives thinking about the heat, but anyway. So there's updates to Blackwell. We're obviously, Blackwell B100, B200. They're talking about Blackwell Ultra, which is the B300. 2 times the memory to 288 gig. So more memory, therefore more sort of larger models in memory, and therefore better performance when inferenced and trained across that cluster. Actually, the one thing that it talked about was, to improve the performance of FP4, 50% performance increase of FP4, which is good for inference, right? So the floating point 4 performance of the chip relative to the B200. So like better performance, which is great for inference, which we think that's where the tail of AI really is. And that's where the sort of the volume is going to go to. And then beyond that, which I think is really known and expected, then there's like the next edition, right? The next GPU, which is Rubin.
Yeah, the Rubens.
So the R series of chips. And so, the one that, I don't have it in front of me, but, I think the standalone GPU, like let's take one step back. An H100 does 700 watts. An H200 it can do up to 1,000, I believe, with some, with the extra memory, or it can be down cycled. Anyway, it's in that ballpark. Where are we? The B300 will do 1,400 watts. So that's a 40+% increase, generation over generation. More memory, more performance, all that stuff. The Rubin chip will do 1,800. which is another 400 watts on top of that. And if you put them all together and, put them all together in a rack and you liquid cool the thing, we're talking at a Rubin Ultra, which will be the generation after, the first edition. We're talking 2027, maybe 26, is an 819 kilowatt rack,
Yep.
which is insane.
And that's what it's rated for, right? So the other thing that we've seen with the GP200s is they're rated for, 135 kilowatts, right? But you plug them in, and then there's that 20-second kind of burn-in phase, right? Where everything spins up and there are instances there of it drawing 200 kilowatts, right? Plug in an 819 kilowatt rack, is the burn-in phase going to apply in the same way, right? Are we going to end up with, 1.2 megawatts of power draw for a little bit for a single rack, right? That's going to be fun to call.
Wow. And that's the thing, and I think, again, going back to, if you think about a standard rack deployment in a standard air-cooled data center, they're 10, 15 kilowatts. So,
and that's generous, right?
Yeah. And so,
8 kilowatt racks.
Sure. And so, you go back to the fundamentals of a data center were, many of them and most of them are raised floors. The air is pumped up. They may be hot oil contained, to pull out the hot air. But essentially, these things are being rolled into raised floor buildings. And so when you do a 10x density heat, property, and you try and roll that onto a raised floor, number one, you've got weight problems because you've got all this liquid cooling, you've got all this weight. We were working at back in a different life. I was working for Amazon, and we had these things called tanker racks. Essentially, it was a storage rack for S3. I've probably just given a code name away unintentionally, but we had these tanker racks, and they were so heavy that you had to ensure that, in every location that we could get these things in. And it wasn't just the floor tiles. It was like in some, countries, we had data centers on different floors. So Singapore is, there's not much land, and you go up floors. Can the thing get into the loading dock? Can it get into the lift well, the goods lift? Can it actually traverse all these different places to get to its final position? And hope like hell that that's the final position. And so, with these, large clusters, you've got to think about not just one or two racks, but tens and dozens and, hundreds of racks. So your raised floor is basically useless, to some degree for all
it's
these
stuff. How thick is your concrete now?
And now it's how thick is your concrete, and are you on the first or second floor? Because if you're not, these things can't go there. So the availability, and that's just for the 100 kilowatt or 130 odd kilowatt racks. These are
the GB200 GB200 is 1.4 metric tons.
Exactly. Right. So, the amount of poured concrete that's needed to, support this stuff, and, it just really limits the availability of where to put this stuff. And then I guess you're going up 6.5 times to 819 kilowatts. And so data center providers that are just thinking about liquid cooling and going, well, we can give you plumbing to your rack position underneath the raised floor. I mean, that data center is basically, its usable life just shrank, at least for AI, to the next 18 months. And so, there's this huge build going on as a result, across the industry, that is currently occupied at 97, 98%, at least in North America. I'm not too sure what Europe's like, but I assume it's a similar occupancy, but certainly North America is high. And, but there's going to be, so I guess if I think about the supply coming on to we're needing to come on, the demand there, but then the availability is that third piece. Where are we going to availably deploy this stuff?
I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic shift.
That's before we get power. So power, right. I think, is kind of, they're solving it by saying, we'll just do, gas turbines, and we'll just, go behind the meter, do it ourselves. That's what Elon did. That's what, and to your point, with those power fluctuations of these large loads coming on and off. So, between models and between training, processing, there's these huge ebbs and flows of GPUs, and hundreds or even thousands of them. In his case, 100,000 or 200,000 coming on and offline, going from 0 to 100% utilization. So, the reverberations of that electricity, footprint as it oscillates between those two, utilizations is enormous, and things break in line because they just can't, they're not expected or designed to perform in that way. So there's really a reckoning across the industry, where to put it, how to manage it, how do I even power it, supply, distribution, cooling, whether it's, air, liquid, direct to chip, or sort of other things. So yeah, it's really, I've got concerns about that. We just can't go 8x every year.
Yeah, and I mean, I think data center availability and data center suitability is going to be a really interesting further factor to model into what's going to happen with GPU per hour charges, right? So with the hoppers, they're cooled. So relatively easy to get quite a lot of capacity into the market. Now, you may end up in a situation whereby you've got like one machine in a rack, and then you've got like 128 racks each with one machine in, which isn't necessarily the most efficient use of space, but you're still going to be able to power it. I've heard from our friends at CBRE that I think 4%, 3%, 4% of data centers in Europe are currently capable of supporting the GB200. That capacity's gone. If you're hearing about it now, it's too late. It's already spoken for. So I think how difficult and how few data centers are going to be able to support the GB200 systems is probably going to be, I think it's going to help protect the margins, I think, on this hardware cycle a little bit more than we saw with the hoppers.
Well, just on that note though, Ben, I think the interesting thing is exactly to your point, and I've seen it firsthand, some data center providers can do higher densities per rack. So I've seen those, HGX infrastructures deployed into, there's been 2, maybe 4 per rack. I think I've seen 4 very frequently. It's mostly been 2. And, if you bring it back to 1. But the reality has been, not the reality, but a data center operator bills you for power, not position. They don't bill you for white space as a service. They bill you as, how much power you're using. And so if you don't happen to be dense, but there's availability of space, they don't really care. I think they are going to start to care when they see ones, 1 all the way down a data hall and go, I could actually, there's 2 ways to do this. One, I improve my ability to cool higher densities, which is a capital outlay. But to do that, I need to make some more money. So if I will start charging for those folks that are using up all the space I can't repurpose for another 10 kilowatt, another 15 kilowatt customer. Like, you're taking up those positions. You're going to pay the average price on top of what you're using, because you're wasting my positions. So like, I think there's a, let's call it a business plan update that will change, because it won't pencil out for these data center providers as much as what has traditionally worked for them.
So what we've seen with the data center pricing is when we're modeling a given cluster opportunity in a given data center, we've got the per kilowatt hour charge. Now, is that pass through? Is the data center making margin on the power, potentially because they've got on-site power generation? That's something that we can figure out. But then the other half of that is what's the per kilowatt footprint costs. So what's the charge that a given data center is? What are you charging a customer for access to 1 kilowatt over the course of a month, right? And for the higher density facilities, because they can support higher density, it does tend to come in a little bit lower, depending on the nature of the facility and depending on the market in which they're operating, standard kind of market forces, all of that sort of stuff. Right? So potentially there could be a situation whereby you've got someone who's got like 1 server in a rack and they've taken up the entire space. But then equally, if you've got one of these super high-end machines, you're drawing 14 kilowatts at max draw. There's a very good chance that it doesn't really matter you've taken up all of the white space, because you've also taken all of the power at the same time.
Well, and that's the Tetris that needs to be played with this thing, right? So the challenge is, it's got to be. I think what I guess I'm talking about is like penciling out relative to the capacity utilization, the capacity availability. And then, as you know, like, these things are really difficult to map out at the best of times. If they're changing every 2 years, you don't want to be moving these things around. But equally, things get stranded, right? So I've got stranded cooling capacity in one data hall that I could use over here, but it's such a nightmare to move things around that I'm kind of stuck. Similarly with white space, similarly with network availability, right? So even just plugging these things in, running like, miles and miles of cables becomes challenging, or even interconnecting at the speed I need can also be a challenge. These things like to be really close together. And so the economies of scale works that, these clusters are sized, appropriately and kind of in SKUs, if you want to call them that, because like pods, super pods and that type of stuff, because that unit of math works across all the components north, south in a rack. And so, but what I was on a call this week with an analyst asking about, the liquid cooling and things like that. And so I was just sort of looking at the updates to this and 820 odd kilowatts and beyond, right? When it's sort of at peak. And, the CDUs for liquid cooling take up 2 racks, right? Like a CDU to support 1 megawatt is 2 racks. So you're going to have 2 times the footprint for your cooling technology just to cool some, well, let's call it majority, but and most of the critical infrastructure in that rack, but you still need air cooling. Like that whole rack that you're going to be putting that into still needs, it's going to have network switches, it's going to have NVLink, all that kind of stuff, which is not liquid cooled. So it still needs a nice environment and to lay back and chill out in 25 degrees C. So, you're not, it's just more of everything to support this stuff. So it's kind of interesting to see how, trying to work out where that puck's going to be. And it's like, where is it? Was it one thing? And it's kind of everything.
Yeah,
you
right.
make that one change to that GPU and the butterfly effect around it as it relates to these infrastructures is huge impact.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a pretty compelling argument for modular to a degree, right?
Yeah.
And when I say modular, I don't necessarily mean taking a shipping container full of compute and whacking it in the car park, right? Although there is a pretty compelling argument for doing that, right?
Yep.
Modularizing the white space is also something which is going, I don't see how it can't happen if you're looking at serving AI customers, given the product cadence, right? Given how quickly we're seeing rack densities and also capability increase. You're going to have to make things easy to swap in and swap out and upgrade. Because if not, then the 2 ways to win in this market are 1, speed, and 2, cost of capital, right? And if you've got your cost of capital taken care of, but you're slow, there's going to be someone who wins, right? If you can modularize things, that's going to massively increase the speed with which you can cater to shifting demands, because you're going to have that degree more flexibility. And that's what everyone needs to be at the moment, right? Because everything is moving so fast, you end up with another DeepSeek moment or something along those lines, right? And it changes the dynamics of the market, and it's bad for some people and it's good for others. Being able to adapt to those things is essential, from a software level all the way down to the infrastructure level, right? It's adaptability, and modularizing the white space to me seems like the best way to do that.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point you bring up DeepSeek, because I was asked a similar question on, the DeepSeek moment and people's sort of situation or kind of opinion about, was this going to mean that we don't need GPUs anymore? We need less of them and everything else. And so, there's a lot of discussion of pro, for and against that argument. And I think what will play out is what we've seen play out, at least in the short term, is that, you bring the cost down, or the availability or the outcomes more quickly, you just do more of it, right?
Yeah, right.
So, yeah. So, and I always get it wrong.
Jevons paradox.
Jevons paradox. And so essentially, I think that will play out further. What's interesting though is, I was asked, like, what are the 3 or 4 different things that would potentially, because I'm pretty bullish on AI across the board. I think we have, when you're in the industry, you can get challenged on your own biases by being on that hype cycle, going to GTC conferences and, spending a week down there. And so you can kind of be on
with the other cult members.
Exactly. Sing Kumbaya with Jensen.
Right.
And so, yeah. And so I think, a couple of the things that I sort of thought about, outside of, quantum, which is always, 5-10 years coming, and there's chips and there's, there's speculation about this is good, this is bullshit, this is other, was things on the software side. So like you said with DeepSeek, they did some things differently, and they shortcut to get to those outcomes more quickly using using known or similar, methods to get there. But really, like a transform, like I'm thinking about what updates they might come out next week, and we'll see some CUDA stuff. I'm not so really deep on the software side, but what I think might take place over time is updates to those transformers, let's call it Transformer 2.0. That enables, less compute with more, performance, utilizing the GPUs or a different type of GPU in a different way that gives you a faster, better other outcome. Transformers really enabled all this stuff, the software kind of, architecture, but a next gen version of that, or a update that, makes that go faster, this is called 2.0, has the ability to sort of, repurpose a lot of this compute. I think a lot of people are kind of going, every generation that goes up is for training, and the previous generations kind of get folded into inference. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out on the software side, because that's probably a reasonably large threat of, the gravy train continuing as it's been, outside of, just the cost of it being, increasing and to the right. So I don't know, like I'm a bit, I won't say nervous, but like, if there's one thing that makes me less bullish is kind of one of the things I mentioned before, availability and suitability, to your point on where I deploy it, the power that needs to be deployed both on site and or at the utility and or, by the country. Things need to happen in regulatory markets to change nuclear, kind of viewpoints and things like of that nature. And then on the software side, there seems to be a huge opportunity for software to really change the game. I think the hardware's in front of the software.
Yeah, I mean, Nvidia is a software company, right? That's the tagline. They're a software company that makes hardware. And I think there was the Run AI acquisition happened relatively recently. And the thing that kind of surprised people there was that they open sourced it. And not only that, but it can run on any hardware. It's hardware agnostic, right? And I mean, from a hardware standpoint, Nvidia is 95% dominant from a market perspective. It's a lot of dominance, and it's very difficult to go one way, but it's very easy to go the other way in terms of that dominance, right?
My immediate reaction to that was like, well, that's going to help antitrust kind of conversations. I mean,
right. So no, it's open source. Fine.
Yeah, it's open source.
That's a different conversation, right?
I'm good for the people.
But no, I think like the software side is interesting. So to your point, right, and I think this goes all the way from the application layer down to how you're optimizing your workloads. Are you running your workloads efficiently, right? And I think that's what DeepSeek showed, that a lot of the larger players were not necessarily being as efficient as they could have been.
Well, they're talking like 30, 40% GPU utilization. Like you go and buy billions of dollars worth of infra and you're sitting at 30%. Like that's a big problem.
Yeah, right. So I think there's probably more that can be squeezed out at that level. Again, I'm not super down in the software level. My focus tends to be on financial models and how much can I sweat these assets for, how many tokens can I get through this system, and what's gonna give me the best upside.
Totally. Well, on that point though, so on DeepSeek, they were doing things at they were going below CUDA, like they're going at, the bloody system level, compiler level, before CUDA even starts. It's, they're just underneath that, getting better lower level access to that hardware to get better performance. And so, getting it to do things that no one else can, because they've got 5 of the 10 people on the planet that can actually do it. So it's pretty, that probably even additionally proves that point on there's software changes, updates to leverage, and the hardware just keeps accelerating and going faster. It's kind of ahead in my opinion. So
yeah, and there's always going to be more ways that you can squeeze more value out of whatever it is that you've got, right? And I think with the open source versus closed source battle that is ongoing at the moment, which is being wrapped up in geopolitics, it's really interesting to see what is being done on the open source side, which is challenging, I think, a lot of narratives that I think a lot of people have known were really just kind of narratives, but the tide is going out and people are swimming naked, as it were.
Yeah, haven't got the pants. We're talking about a couple of things with GTC next week. Maybe on the GPU side, there's obviously discussions like, we talked about GB200. That's obviously the Grace side of that processor is the CPU.
Mm-hmm.
The next addition to that is Vera. So Vera is their 2nd generation ARM CPU, which will be interesting to see that. I mean, Grace has been with us for a couple of years, and it'd be interesting to see what that looks like and what sort of adjustments and achievements have been made there. I was initially thinking about all these companies having to rewrite and re-architect some of their code that has traditionally been, and even like a lot of this AI, well, let's call it machine learning, prior to GPUs has been run on x86. Now it's probably been virtualized and probably migrates pretty easily. But I was always interested in seeing how these ARM chips, which, are much more power efficient and can be quite wide, right? A lot of cores and good performance, just to see how they run. So I'll be curious on the Vera side. There's obviously updates on the networking side. One of the things I think I saw last year was what appeared to be a consolidation or amalgamation of their InfiniBand and Ethernet switches. I'll be interested to see what the updates there are, because I think Spectrum is kind of getting a handle on the market, and it's shown even at the top, tippity top, like the Elon's cluster is running Ethernet. And so, you can do a lot with Ethernet. The Ethernet, Ultra Ethernet Consortium this year is coming out with products. I wonder InfiniBand's future, long-term future, let's call it, beyond kind of, current and maybe next gen, because it doesn't appear that there's a roadmap and a path forward for that as an independent system or service. It might live on in software, inside those switches as a dual purpose type function. I don't know. I'll be curious to see what gets discussed there with 1.6T and updates there. Everything's 2x at least. And then one thing, so I wrote one of these notes because it talked about people talking about new partnerships and stuff. But what I always giggle about is everyone's a partner to Nvidia. Like, everyone's announcing a partnership, and there's a partnership here and there's a partnership there. I think 90% of the people are partners with Nvidia. On their, I don't know whether there's logos attached and different things, different schemes, different programs. It's been my experience in a number of different companies dealing with Nvidia specifically, is you can be in all of their partnership agreements and schemes and things, but like trying to get someone and get directly to the person you need to get to is like, where's Waldo? You're just trying to find someone, even though it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. They haven't got enough staff employed, in my opinion, to monitor and manage all the people they have partnerships with. They couldn't possibly manage them all.
I mean, they've gone from a $300 billion company, a company in 2022, to a $3 trillion company. I imagine there are probably a few teething problems going on that come with that kind of growth in that short period of time.
Yeah. Well, you've just got like every Fortune 500, you've got like all these smaller startups. Like we were dealing with them in Australia on a startup I was working with. And, the company I was working with, we were one of 5 in Asia Pacific that were allowed to sort of have someone dedicated to talk to them. Everyone else, it was like, it's all too hard. So it was, they were doing that back 2.5 years ago. So it's, I don't envy that position. And then maybe just sort of wrapping things up a little bit. Maybe I had two kind of questions. What are you looking forward to seeing next week? What are you looking forward to doing, seeing, meeting? What's your schedule look like? Tell me about your next week.
The schedule, I can answer that very simply and very succinctly. It's a disaster. The joy of suddenly finding a degree of notoriety on social media means that all of a sudden I am in demand in a way that I have never previously been in demand.
You're a rock star, dude. You're going to be,
God, what a weird spot to be in. I heard that a couple of times at DCW, and honestly, I have no mental model for how to deal with it right now. So that's been a fun learning experience of how do I engage with people who know quite a fair bit about what I'm about when I have no idea
their name,
who they are.
Do. Yeah.
So that's going to be a fun one. But then on the other side of that as well, the thing that I'm looking forward to the most is meeting everyone, right? Meeting all of these people that I've had interactions with, like yourself, right? And so much of the world now takes place online, and going to, I made the joke earlier, right? Like going and joining the other cult members. I'm looking forward to going and joining the other cult members, right? And being able to meet everyone in person. And then, I mean, there's always a curveball, right? From GTC last year, there was a curveball. From every announcement, hardware announcement, software announcement, anything announcement that Nvidia does, there's always a curveball that no one seems to have picked up on. There's going to be another one. There's always one, right? Whatever that is, it's going to be super interesting how the market responds to that, both in terms of like the wider market and like everyone who's there as well, and being able to be in the same place as everybody else. And I mean, talk about this niche little area of industry that we're all operating in with people that understand it and get as excited about everything that's going on as I do. It's going to be a fun time.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fun. It's going to be exhausting. It's an
Right.
exhausting conference as always, and this particularly, it's one of my favorite ones. I mean, OCP is a really good one too. I enjoy that. They put on a great, great week. But this one's, kind of there's a bit of a hype train that goes with it too. So you see folks that aren't necessarily in the industry that but are there too. That's a good kind of a buffer, just other to sort of you know uh, let's say dilute the cult a little, which is nice. But
New members,
exactly,
join us.
future culters. So yeah, yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. It's gonna be lots of fun. And one last question I had for you was, like, obviously in the resale business, and then in kind of dissecting this stuff as you do with the GPU and things, what is one thing Nvidia could do to make your life easier? Like, what sucks? And you're like,
Oh,
this is so frustrating and annoying. What would one thing, or maybe you got more than one, but I'd be curious to see if that's on the resale side, it's on the dissemination of information side, it's on the software side. I mean, is there anything that comes to
it's a
mind?
good question. Slow down. Um, I think it is the biggest one, right? Because I mean, it's keeping up with everything is hard work.
Yeah.
And it's okay keeping up with like the surface level stuff, and right, like this happened, and this is what kind of what the surface level implications of that are going to be. But like understanding how all of the various bits and pieces kind of fit together, and then like what does this mean? Not just next week, like which would be something different. What
Yeah.
does this mean a little way further down the line? Piecing together all of those bits and pieces. That's hard work, but slowing down is an unreasonable request. So one really, really, really simple request that would make my life so, so much easier is make it easy to find out how much power the
Mm.
systems draw when they're plugged in and they're not doing anything. When I'm trying to figure out how much it's going to cost me to run something at 0% utilization, it's really difficult to find out that information. I just want to know how much the system uses when it's not running, like
Yeah.
when it's just idling. Make that easy for me.
Yeah, I think the reference architectures are sometimes difficult to sort of get to, and there's no real repository for that documentation as it relates to like a library that you would expect, because everyone who's placing these things together and kind of compiling them needs some of those schematics. They need to know the physical dimensions, the environmental, properties, the distances between, like, what would a cable, like all that stuff is really important when you're trying to deploy this stuff. So yeah, I agree on that front too. One thing I think I would love Nvidia to do, and there's been kind of whispers about them doing it, is warranting GPUs that are, in a fluid, in an immersion dielectric fluid. And so there's chitter chatter and whispers about what they're doing internally, about what they're doing privately with private companies, which I've seen sort of first and second, and maybe even third hand to some degree. So I would love, love, love for there to be some things there, because if I look at that heat dissipation and I look at where that's going, it's liquid cooling or bust, and you can do liquid cooling in a number of different ways that aren't necessarily being used at scale today, that would be very effective, to deploy this stuff in existing data centers, right? So, I think it'd be interesting to see how they architect the Rubin Ultra Rack in a way that
How are
makes
you going to call that?
sense.
How are you going to call that? Like 800. I mean, the other
Put it on
piece
the
there, I
moon,
think.
I guess.
But I mean, what have you got? You've got like Lone Star Data Holdings, Lumen Orbit. They're working on it. They're working
You're
on
looking
that.
at my portfolio.
Right? Although, what is it? It's like $3,000 per kilogram to get into orbit at this stage. You've got 1.4 tons of rack. That's going to be a pricey deployment, right? And
Yeah,
I'm
that's
sure that the wafers might not necessarily enjoy the G-force associated with going into orbit. Might be a bit
yeah.
of a challenge, but it's fine. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention.
It'll work. It'll work.
But I think at that point, right, at that level, it really does beg the question: are you going to want to be in the room with something with drawing that much power? Right? Are you
Well,
going to want to touch it?
no. I mean, the
No,
data center of the
it's
future
basically a
has
transformer.
it has less and less and less humans attached to it. And so these robots that are going to come on the other side of NVIDIA's, stuff, will literally deploy the things that they're, built
They're
from.
running on, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a full circle cycle, which, makes a lot of sense. The intricate details and stuff, like, I'm still kind of hesitant with, but, from a near term aspect. But we were doing this stuff with immersion, and the only reason we had any type of air conditioning in there was because humans went in there and had to go and operate it. And so,
Health and safety.
literally, like, because the heat just sort of rises, and so you sort of, if you crawled around, you'd be fine, because the heat at the bottom is like there's a delta of about 20 degrees C. But at the top of it, when you're walking around, and I'm 6'2", so it's like hot up here, it's quite uncomfortable. But if you look at, I think Submer, who are an immersion company doing, like, they've got their own data center build out, I think in Barcelona. Thank you. And so they're looking at doing robotics with their tanks. And so I think there's a lot of work in that space being done, and I hope will continue to develop to make these solutions more realistic, because I whether it's single phase two, it doesn't matter how it's being done, but cold plates and CDUs and this huge amount of infrastructure, and it looks like that you being plugged into the matrix, I mean, you're going to pull it out of the back of your neck, is cumbersome. It's effective, but it's pretty cumbersome.
Yeah, it's all going in one direction, right? Who knows where we're going to end up?
Yeah,
up and to the right.
Yeah, up and to the right. Hockey stick.
Everything is up and to the right.
Yeah. Well, mate, thanks. I really appreciate jumping on. I know you're busy in the lead up to GTC. You'll be busy next week. Look forward to, we'll catch up for a coffee, a beer, a burger, or kind of all three. Would be lots of fun. It'd be great to meet. People obviously know you from the GPU and your resale business. What, they can follow you on those areas? Do you want to do any plugs? Like, what are things?
So I mean, LinkedIn is the best place. That's where I'm the most active at the moment. Subscribe to the newsletter, the GPU.ai. If the newsletter itself doesn't work, I'm sure I'll be able to flog that domain for a few quid at some point in the future as well. So I'm pretty happy I'm sat on that. If anyone wants the datacenter.ai and the application.ai as well, send me a message and we can have a conversation.
Nice.
I've got those too.
You're not camping at all?
Yeah, no. Or I might end up doing something newsletter related with them at some point in the future.
Yeah, well, that's what you tell the judge.
Yeah, right. This is my IP. It belongs to me at the moment. Those are the best places to find me. And GTC next week. Sure. Come and say hello. There's a very good chance that I won't know who you are, but you've probably got a better idea than me. And you will get to watch me wrestle with that interaction over and over and over again, because I haven't quite figured out how to do it just yet.
It'll get easier, I'm sure, mate. But yeah, no, it's a great community for folks going there that will likely, come up and get selfies and things. So it'll be good fun, mate. I look forward to catching up with you in person. Pleasure as always. Thanks for the chat. And yeah, mate, I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
All right. Thanks, Ben.